All right, here in chapter 15, we are going to start talking about how our body defends us against these invaders. Now that we've learned about microbes and how they can cause disease, now let's focus on ways our body helps protect us. So this chapter is focusing mainly on what we call the innate defenses, which are not specific. This is a great summary figure. I feel like this is really important to understand, at least as a base, and then you can add in details once you get these core concepts figured out. So again, first of all, the main goal here, we're talking about host defenses. And again, we pretty much divide them into the innate defenses. That's what we're focusing on here in chapter 15. And then we'll talk more about the acquired defenses, which are more specific whenever we get to chapter 16. Now we can further break down the innate into what we call the first line defenses and then the second line defenses. Then our acquired defenses make up what we call the third line. So essentially we have, if we think about like the military, and we're defending, we have like the first row, the second row, and the third row infantry. So kind of the first defense, second, and third. So the first and second are both rather non-specific, so they're part of our innate system. So if we look at the first line defenses, this is mainly just surface protection. So we especially think about our skin. So just anatomical barriers or like mucus that essentially is just a natural way to keep microbes out of our body. Doesn't matter what kind of microbes, good or bad. Then if something does get past those first line, those anatomical barriers, now our second line defenses, this is going to be some more cellular and chemical systems that come into play. And that's whenever they get past that first line kind of surface defense. But again, the main thing here with that second line is that they're not specific. So this is going to include things like phagocytosis, so our immune system eating different bacteria. Inflammation, so leading to the redness and the swelling, trying to limit the ability and keep those invaders in one location. Fever that activates our immune system also makes it a little harder for microbes to divide. And then some antimicrobial products like lysozyme, for example, that get released, the kind of just general purpose enzymes that can break down different bacteria. Again, our first line defenses, those are the physical barriers. Again, our skin, microbiota barrier. So this is that normal flora or microbiota. Again, the good bacteria that live and cover our surfaces so the bad ones can't get in. They're actually part of our first line defenses. And then we also have some chemical barriers. So like salt on our skin makes it hard for some microbes. Again, it's very non-specific, but it's a defense that we can use. So then our acquired, that we'll talk more about in the next chapter, this is actually going to be that specific defense. So this is going to be antibodies being produced or viruses being attacked. And this uses B and T cells in our immune system to produce antibodies or to kill cells that are infected by viruses. So again, just a great summary figure you should kind of be able to walk through and describe and definitely understand and know where things belong. All right, and this is just kind of breaking it down into another kind of table format that may be easier. Again, those first line defenses, those are just the barriers to block invasion, just keeping them from coming in. There's no recognition, so it's not like, oh, there's a Staph aureus bacteria that doesn't belong here, let's get rid of it. It's just a general purpose, non-specific way. So again, it's very general in action. As well as those second line defenses, also non-specific, but it's just internalizing kind of a system that protects cells and fluids, again, inflammation and phagocytosis, not to one specific, but just to an invader in general. The benefit of these is it acts very rapidly, very quickly, so that we can defend ourselves against those invaders. Then whenever we get to that third line, that acquired defense, this is again going to be to a specific foreign substance. So each one, again being very specific, would activate one of those B or T cells that are lymphocytes. So again, it produces a unique protection aimed at that microbe, and we can get some long-term immunity after we've been exposed. So just some basic immunology here. That's just the healthy functioning immune system. Why do we need that? Of course, that's pretty intuitive, I think, but it does surveillance. So it's just randomly checking for any foreign invaders. So the idea is that if it comes in contact with a self cell, there's no reaction. That while it's doing its surveillance, it's like, oh no, this cell belongs here. So no immune system. Whereas if it does come into contact with a foreign cell, it recognizes something like a flagella, or it recognizes lipopolysaccharide or something that shouldn't be in our cells, and then it creates a response or leads to a response. So it can recognize those foreign materials, something that doesn't belong, and then ultimately destroys that foreign substance. Now, how does it know what is self and what isn't? So this is referred to as pathogen. Again, pathogen are microbes that cause disease. So how do we recognize those versus those that aren't harmful to us? So this uses those white blood cells that are surveilling and looking, kind of searching for any potential problems. So they are trained to recognize self so that it does not create an immune response. Now, unfortunately, there are autoimmune diseases like lupus or type 1 diabetes in which the immune cell actually recognizes a normal self cell and attacks it, and it leads to disease. But typically, our immune system would recognize our cells as self, and then any foreign substance or potential invader as non-self. So how do they do that? So they have different antigens or markers. Those are the non-self things that don't belong. So these are molecules on the surface. So again, lipopolysaccharide that's on those gram-negative cell walls, or teichoic acid and gram-positive, different proteins or sugars that we don't produce. So again, it's evaluated then by the immune system. So is this harmful or is it not? So this normal functioning immune system, again, those substances have to be recognized as a threat and then dealt with. So those self cells and chemicals must not come under attack. Otherwise, we get those autoimmune disorders that I just mentioned. So many are a result from mistakenly attacking our own cells. So again, rheumatoid arthritis is another example in which those immune cells attack the joints and the tissues, causing a lot of pain and a loss of function because there was an error to where it was programmed to destroy a cell that did belong in the body. So then how do these cells know what to recognize? So there are different patterns, and there are two here that we talk about. So PAMPs, which are pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So these are going to be different markers that lots of different microbes have in common. Again, that lipopolysaccharide, a cell wall. Our cells don't make cell walls. So peptidoglycan, so flagella, things like that that don't belong, that are unique to pathogens or unique to microbes. Those are things they would recognize. So then we also have PRRs, which are pattern recognition receptors. Okay, so the pathogens have these patterns on them. Well, then our cells need to recognize those patterns. So we have receptors. So that's on the host cell, and those are going to recognize those, and that's part of our second line defense. So they would recognize kind of those patterns. Again, just something weird that doesn't belong. It's not real specific. Again, lipopolysaccharide, all gram-negative cells have that. So again, it's just something that doesn't really belong. So that second line defense recognizes those pathogen-associated patterns and creates a response. So then what are some of the different tissues, organs, and cells that are part of the immune system. So we have the mononuclear phagocyte system. Those are just all the cells that are that can go through phagocytosis. So not every cell can do that, where it engulfs and eats a microbe or a foreign invader. So we have those phagocytes to do that for us. Our extracellular fluid, or ECF, that's the fluid around, all of our cells. So this interstitium is the name for that space, and especially where the lymph is. So the lymph is kind of where the surveillance happens. So a lot of our lymphocytes hang out in the lymph, and they're just looking for anything that doesn't belong. And then our bloodstream, of course, we need just to transport those products. Our lymph, again, this network of vessels and accessory organs like our spleen. And these are just places to transport the lymph, and essentially it drains them back into the circulatory. Its role, though, is just surveillance. So it's a way for those lymphocytes and immune cells that hang out in the lymph to come in contact with those potential foreign invaders. So it's just a little bit more here about the lymph. So again, as we mentioned, this just kind of connects that extracellular fluid around our cells back into the circulatory system. Again, it's just kind of this drainage system that's mainly used for after inflammation, that kind of gets rid of some of that fluid after we have the swelling. But again, kind of the main thing is it has that place for surveillance, so that those immune cells can come in contact, they can recognize and then protect us against those foreign materials. And this is just kind of showing where these are. So of course our circulatory system shown here on the left with our blood vessels, veins and arteries, and then in green the lymphatics. So as you can see, they pretty much just go hand in hand. Where the lymph is, it just kind of overlays and goes along with our circulatory system so that it can drain in there. And of course we have these different lymph nodes, which are collections of those cells throughout the body, as well as different organs, again, like the spleen, the thymus. These are all, like our tonsils, these are all part of that lymphatic system. So those organs include the primary organs, like the red bone marrow, and also the thymus, which is where we're producing our B and our T cells that help with that acquired immunity. And then the secondary organs are the lymph nodes, the spleen, and then we have salt, malt, and galt that are all lymphatic tissues. The different names, like the galt is our gut associated lymphatic, so they're just associated with different systems. But again, they're all doing the same thing. They're a place for that surveillance, a place for those lymphocytes and those immune cells to recognize foreign invaders. So then the associated lymph tissues. So again, these are just bundles of those lymphocytes right under the skin or the mucus, so right under that first line barrier, so that if something does get through those barriers, then these accessory or these associated tissues can recognize them. And again, they're just based on where they're at. So skin associated is salt, mucosa, so all the linings like our respiratory system or the vaginal tract, that's the malt. Again, our tonsils, the breast during pregnancy and lactation, and then finally the gut associated, so like the appendix is an example of the galt. All right, and this is just kind of a nice little summary. In anatomy and physiology, you learn all about the different red blood cells, like the different types of white blood cells, sorry. So those leukocytes, whether neutrophils, basophils, all of those. For here, we're just mainly focusing on our lymphocytes, which are the B and T cells. We'll talk more about those in chapter 16 with acquired immunity. But then we have our macrophages and our dendritic cells. These are phagocytic. They're more part of that innate system. And of course, we also have our red blood cells that carry that oxygen. We have platelets that are important in clotting. They also help a lot with inflammation that is part of that innate system as well. And then starting with that first line defense, so those physical and chemical barriers. So some of the physical Again, it's just our skin. So if the microbe can't get past the skin, again, the mucus that lines our respiratory tract, those are all just physical barriers. Thinking about chemical though, so we have that mucus, we have lysozyme in the tears that help break down the cell wall. So the acid in our stomach that naturally destroys different microbes. But again, these are all very non-specific. They're just naturally getting rid of multiple types of bacteria. Now, our resident microbiota is another part of that first line defense. This is providing what we call microbial antagonism. So microbial, because it's microbes, and antagonism just means to defend against. So this is blocking access. So if the normal flora, the bacteria that normally live and reside on or in our body, if they're there, it essentially just covers up those epithelial surfaces. Now, some of them, though, also make it unfavorable. So even if the pathogen could attach, those normal microbes are better able to compete for nutrients. And some of them even release chemicals that alter the pH. So this kind of biota that lives in our body kind of trains the host defense on what is good and what is bad. So what's pathogenic versus what's okay, and can be part of that normal flora. So some of the innate chemical defenses, so we mentioned already this lysozyme, but the sebaceous secretions, that is going on our skin, that has an antimicrobial effect. So even if they land there on those sebaceous glands, it releases chemicals that naturally break down microbes. Again, lysozyme that's in our tears and our saliva, that breaks down peptidoglycan that's in the cell walls there of bacteria. That lactic acid and electrolytes that's in sweat make it acidic and salty. Lots of microbes can't live there, as well as some different fatty acid contents. Again, it's just natural things that microbes don't typically like. Some of our other ones, so the hydrochloric acid in the stomach, different digestive juices that are breaking down proteins in our gut are also breaking down proteins and microbes. Same thing with bile, have those digestive juices. Also, semen has its own antimicrobials, chemicals that get released, and the vagina, so think about our reproductive tract, it's very acidic there. So again, it helps get rid of natural microbes that need a normal pH.